All right, time to look at the preference settings in Photoshop to make sure you're getting the best performance out of your computer. Now, these settings will streamline your work in the background, making sure you don't have any log jams of resources. And you access the Preferences panel up here, click on the Photoshop drop-down list, come to Preferences, and then click on General. Now, there is a lot here, but much of it you don't have to pay any attention to, but we'll go down to each of these just to show you. Now, this interface is purely your personal preference. I always work in this darker environment. It's just the way my eyes don't get fatigued as quickly. If you know, however, that your end display environment is going to be in a white environment, you might choose to do this because the eye will react to that white environment. It'll make your image look darker. So give that some consideration if you know you're going to be displaying in a bright white environment. So I'll put this back to here where I like it. The workspace, you don't have to worry about that. Tools, you don't have to worry about this. The history log, you don't have to worry about that. File handling, I just leave this in the default. Export, now that's why I say don't use export when you do your conversions from TIFF to JPEG, because all this stuff kicks in and it just gets in the way and you got to undo things, and I just don't like it. So use save as always, never export. Now on performance, this is where you do have to kind of drill down and change some things. Now, I have 16 gigs of RAM in my machine, and 70% of your resources makes everything work real well. Now, in all cases, Photoshop will work faster and more efficiently if you close out all of your other software, especially if you're using DxO Photo Lab. Having both those programs open at the same time, even if I have 16 gigabytes of RAM, invites slowdowns and problems. So shut down DxO Photo Lab if you're going to be using Photoshop for an extended period. As I mentioned, I've got 16 gigs of RAM in my computer. But if you only have 8, then you might want to run this figure up to 80, okay? And it'll run really, really well. Now, in that instance, if you are only operating with 8 gigabytes of RAM and you run this up to 80%, you most definitely have to close out your other software, because just the operating system is going to want to take up the remaining 20%. So just a word of warning. So I'm going to run this back to 70 where it needs to be. You want to check Use Graphics Processor. Now, here are the advanced settings. I wouldn't get too bogged down in these weeds, but there's one thing that I think you ought to consider if you have a machine that's newer than 2014, which most of us do. Use the graphics processor to accelerate computation. You want to check that, make sure it's active. Use OpenCL. Now, I'm not going to get into an explanation of what OpenCL is. Just trust me and check it, yes. Let's see what that little drop-down explanation has to say. You definitely want to use OpenCL. If you have problems, uncheck it, but generally, it's not going to give you a problem. I've never had a problem, and I've always had this checked. Anti-alias guides and paths, 30-bit display, use native operating system, GPU, acceleration, all of these should be checked. Okay, now here's your most important setting over here is your history states. Now, I think, if I recall, that the default is 8 history states. You want many, many, many more history states than 8. I've got mine set at 50. In the past, I have set it up to 100, but in no case should it be less than 50. If I can get it there. 51, who cares? Now, your cache levels need to be 8. Again, it's an explanation that you don't care about, and it'll just put you to sleep. Just trust me when I tell you, you put your cache levels at 8. Cache tile size, this is, I think it is the default figure, and just leave it the way it is. All right, scratch disks. This is a very important thing, and you want your scratch disk to be something other than your operating directory, your OS, your operating system drive. Now, you'll notice here that I'm not doing that, which is a bad thing. Now, your Macintosh HD, that's your internal hard drive on your computer, and I don't have very much free space on that hard drive, so that is why sometimes, especially if I have other software titles open, that I might get a log jam. So choose a drive that's going to be hooked up to your machine. Now, if you choose one of these external hard drives and then you open Photoshop and this hard drive is not plugged in, you're going to get an error message. So whatever hard drive you want to use, just make sure that it's going to be plugged in. And I'm going to go ahead and make this one and undo this one. I think it's going to work a lot better. All right, we're going to say okay to that. All right, cursors, don't bother about that. Transparency and gamut, don't worry about that. Units and rulers, I just leave this the way it is. Guides and grid and slices, these are color preferences, so I care nothing whatsoever about this stuff. Plugins, just leave this the way it is. And I would leave this the way it is. So there really isn't a whole lot you're going to change here, except very, very important is this scratch disks, performance, and file handling. All right, available VRAM for, this is if you do 3D, which I do not do, so I don't care what any of this says. Enhanced controls. Now this is for, I have a 2019 MacBook Pro and it's got one of those touch bar things that I've never used and I hate. So you can choose to leave this checked or unchecked. It's completely your preference. Technology reviews, I have no idea. Oh, previews, that's what it is. Just leave this the way it is. Product improvement. Now, I'm a bit ambivalent about doing this because when it wants to send something, it slows down Photoshop. Yet this really kind of is a valuable thing on a large scale in the long run with all Adobe users. I'm going to check this off because I really don't have that many problems in the performance of Photoshop. That's the great thing about Photoshop is that it's a well-oiled machine. It's very stable. It never crashes. And so, I'll just leave this off. So there you have the preferences that are going to help you get more out of Photoshop as you go forward adjusting your images.